Hello everyone, and welcome to this In Conversation forum, part of the Counterpoint Women in Government series. My name's James Riley, and I'm the Editorial Director of InnovationOz.com. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're hosting this event from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. It's my pleasure to introduce journalist and author Annabel Crabb. Annabel is, of course, one of Australia's most beloved journalists, writers and presenters who has covered Australian politics and society for 20 years. She's renowned for her colourful insights and humorous analysis on gender and on current events. Joining Annabel for the first part of our forum is Verizon Business Group Regional Vice President Rob Busque. Rob has spent many years working and living throughout the Asia Pacific region. He's a classically trained musician. He's a governor of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, and something I found out just today, he's also a member of the Queensland Sudoku team. Rob will discuss with Annabel her recent landmark production, Misrepresented, which is a raw, authentic account of the political environment from the perspective of the women in it. Following this, Annabel will join a panel of exceptional women in conversation about specific career challenges and opportunities and the differences that exist between public sector and private sector work environments. But first, let's set the scene. Here's a short clip from Misrepresented.
The story of women in Australian parliaments is a long and involved one. What not many people know is that it all started in South Australia with a political blunder that changed the world.
It's 1894 in Adelaide.
The idea of votes for women is catching on.
Thanks to advocates like Mary Lee,
the widowed Irishwoman and mother of 7,
who collected nearly 12,000 signatures on a petition to Parliament.
The Premier at the time, Charles Kingston, is a controversial figure.
He came from money, but he's shunned by the Adelaide establishment
due to his fondness for pistol fighting
and womanising.
When he became Premier in 1893, he was actually on parole for challenging a political enemy to a duel in Victoria Square.
Kingston agrees to legislate votes for women, the Adult Suffrage Bill,
which needs an absolute majority to pass.
And women pile into the public gallery to watch.
Among its most passionate opponents is this man,
Ebenezer Ward. He's a journalist and train enthusiast.
Figures under pursuit for alimony,
not by one but 2 ex-wives.
He worries that if women get the vote, they'd bring about the banning of alcohol.
He's notorious for turning up in Parliament drunk.
This is obviously a matter of some personal urgency.
Anyway,
Ward has a brilliant idea.
A classic upper house political manoeuvre.
He amends the bill to give women not only the right to vote, but to stand for Parliament too.
In his game plan, this should destroy the bill.
After all, not even the suffragettes are asking for the right to be MPs.
But Ward is wrong.
Gloriously, horrifyingly wrong.
On the morning of December 18, 1894,
the bill passes.
31 votes to 14.
And at that moment,
South Australian women
become the most enfranchised women in the world.
Annabel, thank you and welcome to today's conversation.
Thank you very much. That theme music always gives me complete panic attacks because it reminds me of racing to finish the edit show.
Well, congratulations on an outstanding series and one that is just so timely. Now, we know that the original intent was to time the series with the 100th anniversary of the first female parliamentarian in Australia. Perhaps talk a little bit about what your personal motivation and your personal objective was in the series.
Right, so Edith Cowan, who was the first woman elected to any parliament in Australia, was elected to the West Australian Parliament in 1921. And I wrote a little bit about Edith in my book, The Wife Drought, about 5 years ago. And at the time I thought, oh, that's going to be 100 years pretty soon. And so I put a little note in my diary thinking that would be a great hook to hang a documentary about the experience of women in Parliament, because I've been talking to women in Parliament for a long time and I observe the way life is different for them sometimes from the way it is for their male colleagues. And one thing that I've learned as a journalist is sometimes if you want people to talk about something, you have to give them a safe space and an opportunity, right? And I notice that I work across different platforms, right? And I know that if I'm writing a news story and I ring up and ask someone to comment and take a personal risk to stake a claim on something, they might think, what are the opportunity costs? Should I do this, should I not? If you're writing a book, they're often more likely to talk to you because it seems more substantial and as though it's a historical kind of thing. So I knew that if I pitched a documentary that was on a major landmark that was going to be a historical thing, I knew that I would have better luck getting women to talk about publicly and on camera about what it's like for women in politics. Because honestly, normally, women are super cautious about talking realistically about what they deal with. Do you know why? I mean, this is the reason why Julia Gillard, you know, avoided the issue of gender for a long time when she was Prime Minister, the first Australian woman to be Prime Minister. And it's because you run the risk of being called a whinger, or for being known only for then talking about women's issues. You know, and you see these women being referred to as outspoken MP, blah, 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 or, you know, even maverick, which is even worse. You know, you can't come back from being a maverick. So the idea was to create a safe space where you had women from all different backgrounds and different political backgrounds, and they knew that everybody else was being interviewed, and I deliberately tried to make them feel like they were on the same side, which is why we did that introductory segment of them telling a story together. It was them together telling essentially the same story about what it's like to be a woman in Parliament.
Wonderful. And from that first little note through the interviews themselves, incredibly insightful interviews and very honest, as you just reflected on. What was the biggest surprise? What did they tell you that you weren't really expecting?
I think the thing that, I mean, this is going to sound like a general sort of answer, but I was quite taken aback by the depth of emotion and honesty in the interviews. And partly I think that's because they knew that everybody, like there were other people giving interviews as well. So they weren't by themselves. They weren't going to be, you know, just this politician X is carrying on about, you know, harassment or whatever. They knew that it would be, they had the cover of it being a multilateral thing. So, and I was surprised too by the emotion that was not very far below the surface a lot of the time. And I think it's because they don't really get asked at length about this stuff. Honestly, if I'm writing a feature article about a female politician, I will throw in a few questions about gender, but I'll never ask them for 3 or 4 hours straight, which is how long I was interviewing these women for, only about gender. And that in itself, I think, opened up some doors. Also, you know, it's been a pretty full-on year. Susan Ryan, who was the first Labor cabinet minister, died very early on in our production season. And so I think that a lot of people, a lot of women, particularly some of the older ones, were very conscious of, oh, you know, I've got to get these stories out. So I think that the program benefited from that for sure.
And certainly they were very honest reflections and stories from their time in Parliament. And, you know, it's not just the government that is dealing with these issues.
Sure.
Organisations large and small in Australia are on the journey of understanding how they respond and improve equity in the workplace. From the experience that you had, those conversations, and also your dialogues in the preparation for, what would you say to those organisations on reflection that they could focus on in terms of action and activity that would have a meaningful impact today?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most important initial steps is actually doing that, creating a safe space where people feel like they're able to share their experiences without fear of reprisal, and feeling confident that there is an organisational process or outlet for what they have to share. I think one of the most striking things about the stories that came from all of the women that I interviewed was that it became really clear that they had a different experience of the building from the experience that men have. And that's not because men are jerks or anything, it's just because they're dealing with different things. And sometimes there would be things that would be totally surprising to a man. I mean, I remember in the incredibly emotional and turbulent time that we had earlier this year in March, when these questions about what happens to women inside Parliament House kind of really started coming to the fore. I remember specifically that press conference that the Prime Minister did, where he said, "Oh, look, I've heard lots of things in the last few days, women telling me, you know, the thing about not being listened to in meetings, the thing about being, you know, ignored or whatever." And it seemed, you know, like he was sort of, "Oh, does that happen?" And I think that that is common in organisations too, because human beings tend to universalise their own experience. And I think there are heaps of patterns of behaviour that women in Parliament House and probably in lots of big organisations absolutely recognise, and they see it as part of their daily landscape, but it's an invisible landscape to men who think, why is it a problem? Like, what do you mean people aren't listened to in meetings? Everybody's listened to. Or something as simple as women often finding that they have to find a way to deal with the fact of their own ambition, because often, certainly in politics and certainly elsewhere as well, often to be ambitious or openly ambitious is counted as a good thing in a man and maybe not such a great thing in a woman. So that's another little area of landscape which is differently shaped for men and women. Like the woman has to put a bit of extra thought into how to still remain kind of likeable whilst also being ambitious, which is just sort of not something that probably has to occur to lots of men.
Of course, and certainly there was that common theme of some of the interviewees reflecting on being the only female in the room and having strategies to manage getting their ideas heard and put onto a level playing field with the men in the room as well.
That's right. And the other thing that I would really recommend, it sounds like such a simple thing for organisations, and I wrote about this a lot in my book, The Wife Drought, is when you're looking at the way women behave in organisations, and you know, there's this thing about, well, why aren't more women putting up their hands for promotion or whatever? Well, educate yourself about why that is, and also keep in mind that nobody's life ends at the end of the office, right? Or at the end of their job, because every person who has a job is going home from that job and dealing with other stuff. Now, whether it's, you know, a competitive Sudoku schedule or it's you didn't think I was going to let that slide, did you?
I was hoping.
Or, you know, you've got little kids, or you're looking after an unwell relative. Like, all of that stuff that is your obligation to look after outside the office. And we know that Australia still is a country where roughly the division of domestic labour is sort of 2 to 1 carried by women. And I think that this pandemic and lockdown is having an extraordinary effect on the burden that women are carrying. And I think the latest CEO, Chief Executive Women Index, which shows that there's really been no new female CEOs appointed of late, is directly related to that. Make sure that you understand, even if it doesn't correspond with your own life experience, I'm saying this to leaders in business, understand what the realities of life are for the people that you are leading, and you will always be a better leader for that. And I think in the current environment where you know, the way the world of work is evolving is, you know, it's about competition for talent. It's about making sure that you can intuitively put together a good team of people. We know that diverse groups of people make better decisions, so that's the direction it's heading in, right? Make sure you know what the world of your workplace looks like to somebody who doesn't have the same background as you.
Absolutely. That's great advice and insight. Thank you. And then finally, Annabel, if there was to be a season 2 of Misrepresented, we hope there is.
I'm still recovering from this one, but yes.
Once you're duly recovered, what would the focus be? Where does the conversation go from here?
Well, look, one of the things that I thought made the program timely is that the proliferation of women in Australian politics is such a recent thing that you can still go and interview the woman who was, you know, walked into the Senate and there weren't any women's toilets, right? Like, I mean, that wasn't that long ago. She's still kicking, she's fine, you know. And the woman who was our first Prime Minister isn't even of retirement age yet, you know. So these are all really recent stories. So for me, it was a great opportunity to tell that history firsthand by the people who lived it. And I think that's true, to be honest, for lots of other areas. So you could definitely do a series on, we could do one on women in sport, that would be pretty interesting. Or, you know, women in mining, that would be super interesting. Or in the law. So I think the key is finding those stories that will be surprising to people who haven't lived them. You know?
Right. Yeah. It's a target-rich environment.
It certainly is.
And we're going to hear plenty more stories in the upcoming panel. So Annabel, thank you very much for this chat. I'll throw back to James to lead us away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob and Annabel. It's fascinating to hear that behind-the-scenes account, and it really reinforces the importance of a program like Misrepresented. We look forward to Annabel moderating our panel shortly. Before that, though, let's take a look at one of the most compelling sequences from Misrepresented, one that really struck a chord.
You are one of the few people in Australian politics who is in a position to observe the difference between being the only woman in a cabinet, being one of 2 or 3, and then one of more. How does that work?
It does make a difference. By the time Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister and we had maybe 5 or 6 women, there was just a sense of this is how it should be. There should be many more female voices around the table, exchanging views and ideas, a different life experience, different background, different perspective. It added to the richness of the debate.
And it sounds like even having another woman in your line of sight seems to have made a difference.
So that I could eye roll at them. Yes, that did help. Seriously. It's a phenomenon that I've described as gender deafness. And it occurs not only in the federal cabinet, but I've experienced it elsewhere. And so many women have told me they've experienced exactly the same thing.
It's one of those classic frustrations that we all have as women in politics.
You do a few eye rolls and you get the raised eyebrow.
It's extraordinary that it persists today.
Of course it's happened to me.
It's probably happened to you.
You're the only woman in a room and you come up with an idea or you say something.
And it's like no one hears you.
You are the only woman and you put up an idea.
And then they look at you and go on debating.
And you think, oh, okay, that was a dud.
And then the next person speaks.
And suddenly, your idea...
It only has to get 2 or 3 chairs along
Till the bloke says it.
And then the next one actually appropriates your idea.
maybe in different terms, and say, oh.
And everyone goes, oh, that's a great idea.
And then all the men around the table nod and say, what a good idea.
Hello? Did I not?
Is there an echo in this room?
It's kind of astonishing when it does. You sort of think,
Didn't I say that?
I just said that.
And all of a sudden everybody heard it and it's a great idea.
Let's go around the room and everyone says what their opinion is. And we'll start with you. What do you think we should do? I said, well, I think we should do ABC. Male number 1. I agree with Anne. We should do ABC. Male number 2. I agree with male number 1. We should do ABC. Male number 3. I agree with males number 1 and 2. By the time we went around the room, they were all patting each other on the back for their wonderful idea that they came up with. This is the power of invisibility that we have.
This is not something that I've created. The number of women who've told me...
That happens all the time.
It's as if men in power, they still find it hard to accept that good ideas can come from women.
I'm pretty sure I can detect a common theme in there. The similarity of experience of these women over decades really is eye-opening. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our brilliant panel. Annabel Crabb, thanks again for joining us. We also have Wendy McCarthy, who's a businesswoman, writer, social activist, and a former university chancellor. An experienced executive and company director, Wendy has championed for change across the public, private and community sectors for decades. We also have Investment New South Wales Chief Executive Amy Brown. Amy is a former Deputy Secretary at the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet and has also worked in infrastructure finance and law in the private sector. Last but not least, Lucy Turnbull. Lucy Turnbull is a businesswoman, philanthropist, urbanist and a former Lord Mayor of Sydney who has a long-standing interest in technological and social innovation. She's currently chair of the Sydney Opera House Trust, among many other roles. Thank you all very much for being here today, and it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Annabel.
Thank you very much, James, for that kind introduction. We may never, ever let you have the microphone again, but you never know. Chance your luck. Look, and thank you to this wonderful panel for being present today. I feel ennobled just to be in your company. That little sequence was actually one of the most, it's my favourite part of the series. One of the things, one of the reasons why is because I was stunned by how many women articulated this experience in such identical terms, so identical, everyone from Bronwyn Bishop to Sarah Hanson-Young, that we could just cut together that sequence. I wanted to start with you, Lucy, and just ask you, you've worked across a whole lot of different spheres in your life. When you saw that sequence, did it ring, did it chime with you?
Absolutely, it chimed across my time in local government, in government administration and also in the private sector. Men have, and I think it's called I call it the invisibility syndrome and the invisibility principle. And I think men are actually highly accustomed to listening to women on a subliminal level, but not actually tuning into the fact that the idea is actually coming to the women. It sort of washes over them and they think, oh, great, let's run with this. And so it's sort of something I don't think they deliberately, filch the intellectual property or anything like that, but it's just this thing where they just let what women say wash over them, and then almost automatically, just if they think it's good, they just appropriate it without giving credit. It's a really bizarre thing, but I've seen it in so many times across a very long time horizon.
And I see you nodding away, Amy, familiarly with this phenomenon. I wanted to know, trying to say this without sounding uncharitable, do you think men know that this happens, or do they recognise it when they do it?
No, I don't think they recognise it when they do it. And I mean, who hasn't experienced gender deafness, particularly where, the male comes up and repeats exactly what you've just said. And, I've taken to saying, is there an echo in here? Interestingly, though, I experienced a lot more when I was an infrastructure lawyer because I often was the only female in the room.
Right.
And the thing that changed for me wasn't me trying to be more like a man. There's a Julie Bishop quote that says, if you're trying to be a man, it's a waste of a woman. So I didn't go down that route. But the reason it's improved over recent years is because in the public service, we're getting more and more females around the table. And the more and more females you have around the leadership table, the less and less this is likely to happen, because you have people to back you up or say, hold on, Andrew, Amy just said that. Or, start to champion each other's ideas and help each other kind of take that seat in the middle of the table and, be the woman who's speaking and putting forward ideas and being backed in on that, and not being the one woman in the room who's, there to pour the waters for everyone and take the Glad wrap off the sandwiches. So we've come a long way.
Now, one of the things that a lot of my interviewees said was, I was amazed actually by how much effort they put into working around this syndrome. And some of them said that the easiest way is to sort of construct this strategy to make it seem like the idea came from a dude. Like, have you seen that happening?
Yeah, Wendy, you've covered.
Well, my experience, I started teaching business courses in the early 90s, all through Asia and Pacific. And I used to do a thing on voice, because I'd found this Punch cartoon called Miss Higgins. And there's a table of men, and it's in the 50s, and she's still alive, this cartoonist. And there's one woman taking the minutes. And the chairman says, "That is a really nice idea, Miss Higgins. I wonder if you could pass it down the road, just to one of these men here." And he puts his hand up and off we go. And the other one is in the 80s, when Alka-Seltzer was having trouble with its sales. And this is a story that the advertising agency told me when I was again raising these issues about voice and ownership of ideas. And they said, yes, there's the apocryphal story about Alka-Seltzer, and they're saying, what are we going to do to pick up sales? And the secretary lifts her head up from the notes. She said, just tell them to take 2 every morning, double the sales. Oh my God, they said, that's a great idea. Thank you, John. And women, I have that as a cartoon, and I teach it whenever I'm with groups of women. I always show them Miss Higgins, and the whole room goes, yep, that's us.
So what fascinates me sometimes is that there are these phenomena or aspects of life in an organisation where a lot of women will just kind of, they don't even have to explain it to each other. Yeah. And the eye roll that Julie Bishop's talking about, I guess, reflects that, right? How do we tackle a world where there's something that's so plainly visible for, let's say, women, but you could substitute other groups of people that are commonly asked the same question? I mean, talk to anyone who's in an ethnic minority who constantly gets mixed up with the other person from that ethnic minority
or
in the
how long have you been here?
Or how long have you been here?
How long have you been here?
Where do you really come from? All of that.
Yeah.
So how do you erase that vast silence from one part of the workplace that simply doesn't notice this stuff that goes on that is so obvious to the affected people?
Call it.
Call it,
You
right?
have to call it.
And I think also the other thing is that there is a growing group of men who are now sort of entering the prime of their careers, say 45 to 65, who had mothers who had very successful or prominent or very significant, or careers that were very significant to the mothers in the household. And I think that they are really respect women a lot more. I know, Malcolm, my husband, his mother was a very strong, forceful career woman, and that, I think, it sort of induces men to have a different perspective of women. It really does. And so, I mean, I always say that the people that you have to persuade to become feminists is actually your sons. Getting your daughters to be feminists really isn't a challenge anymore, but you've got to train your sons to be feminists. Because I always say, if they're grandparents, if your son grows up or your grandson grows up to be a feminist, they're likely to have more children, because if you're in a relationship with a woman, or anyone really, and you take a more equal percentage of the caring and family responsibilities, they'll probably have more kids. Whereas if you grow up with somebody who has, that's my work and that's your work and never the twain shall meet, not many people are going to have a big family. And Italy bears that out.
And Annabel, I think you already mentioned this, but one of the biggest ways that women can be empowered in the workplace is if men are willing to step up and take on more in the home. And how do we actually kind of incentivise and empower men to be able to do that? Because we can't have equal leadership at the leadership table if one party is having to carry a ginormous load outside of work and the other isn't. And from my personal perspective, me and my husband both had kind of careers. We were doing quite well. Our 2 kids came along. His career went on unaffected in his global role, and I was the one, with the full-time job, also with the 57 hours a week of childcare and housework. And it actually took him a redundancy for him, timed at the same time as a promotion for me. And we made a decision that he would stay at home to look after the kids full time. And the most extraordinary thing happened. Firstly, the easing of mental load for me, because I didn't have to worry about the chocolate milk stain t-shirts, for school, meant that my career accelerated massively. But looking after our own children was something he found fulfilling and meaningful, and I'm sure tedious, but fulfilling and meaningful, and he ended up doing it for 3 years. And now, even though he's back in full-time paid employment, he's the primary carer for our kids. Now, I'm not saying that's the answer and every family can or should do that, But the more we incentivise men to take on more at home, the more women can actually be present at the leadership table without that additional mental load above and beyond.
Interesting. I've
there's
lost count of the
why
number
do
of
we
people.
have to do it? Why?
Redundancy. It can be a really good
Redundancy,
thing.
sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Wendy.
But why do we have to do this for men? For God's sake, it's like Stockton syndrome. We say, poor men, you know, go and join a poor men movement. If men can't work it out, or if you can't work it out in today's world, we are doing consent again. We're doing unconscious bias again. We're doing women's rights again. We're doing women's lobby groups again. We're doing childcare constantly. They're not listening to our conversations. We have to get them to hear what we're doing. I'm not accepting the responsibility to change men. You know, I happen to be married to a man who shared the load for a glorious 52 years. But I don't have to give him a lecture about all this stuff. I mean, it goes with the territory. And the more we say, we waste our good time here talking about how we get men to work with us, men should work out that most of them actually want to be like us. They do actually want to be like that. And to be like us, they've got to step up.
Yeah, but also the workplace can put in things in place to incentivise and enable that.
Of
so
course.
instead of flexible work being seen as a woman's thing,
And a lot
you know,
of those things
encouraging
go with
men.
the policy, but
Yeah, that's right.
Well, Annabel wrote about it beautifully in the wife draft. I mean,
Well,
you
but the
did,
wife
you did
draft-
a sensational job there, and I think
It
she
was.
said everything that needs to be said about
But
it.
there was a story about I Want a Wife, which was written, you know, which I wrote to you about and said in 1967. They ran ads in New York Magazine and so on about wife droughts. I didn't call it a drought because I don't know what a drought is in America. but you know, I think I just think men are not extending to us this opportunity. They're not inviting us. We just have to tell them that we love our partners, whether they're male, female, we're talking about men in this instance, but we don't actually have time to run an incentive program for them to work out what's happening in their house.
Well, you said a minute ago, call it.
Yeah,
call it out.
Call
You've
it.
got to breach that kind of gap of understanding. There's only one way to address ignorance, right? Even if somebody is well-meaningly ignorant, information is the only remedy for that problem. And I think actually, as we learn more about leadership in the modern workplace, I think the key to truly great leadership these days is the ability to admit when you don't know something and go and find out, right? And the smart bosses who realise that diverse groups make better decisions and that you have a better decision-making group with women and, I won't say other minorities because women are a minority, if you have a diverse group, you're going to get a better result, you know, in a business sense as well as in a general ethical sense. So, but it takes people to speak out too, right? And we've seen over this year, you know, some, I think, quite tectonic shifts in what we think we can now talk about in terms of politics and what happens to women in politics, and that's a great thing.
Fantastic.
And some of that leadership has been provided by some very young people, right? Young women, like Chanel Contos and Brittany Higgins and so on. What happens, I mean, how do you address the anxiety of people who feel like if I speak out, I'll be labelled a troublemaker? I mean, Wendy, you've been labelled a troublemaker your whole life. Is there a way of...
I was raised as a very good girl by my parents.
Well, went south pretty quickly after that, didn't it?
No, but that's the thing is, I think the whole thing of any woman that speaks out is a pain in the neck or a troublemaker
But
is
it hasn't
actually a
got in my way.
completely wrong
It hasn't got in my way.
conceptualisation. I mean, I think you should challenge. I think I like men who challenge me. I like women who challenge me. I think that whole idea of being challenged is actually fundamental to getting a better result in an organisation or a family group or whatever. You need to be challenged, and I think men, what I would like to think enlightened men, thrive on that, and I think more and more do. Some of them really annoys them, right? But you've got to say, listen, I know I'm challenging you, and I know it's a bit difficult, but it's my job to do that. That's why I'm sitting at the table here.
And a great leader will actually recognise that that is a good thing.
Yeah.
Amy, I want to talk a little bit about public and private spheres, right? I mean, you've all worked across both. But I wonder if you could give me your opinion on the differing roles and strengths and ability to bring about societal change in the private sector and the public sector.
Absolutely. I have thought about this. And Annabel, I think I heard you say in a different context about paid parental leave, actually, the role of the public sector is to move the dial and the private sector normalises it. So the public sector almost has a bit of a responsibility here. And again, the beneficiaries of the work of the public sector are the people of New South Wales, all 8 million of us. So there's a huge incentive for us to get it right. New South Wales Public Service, we are actually starting to gain a lot of momentum around this. So by way of example, the Secretary's Board is the 11-member body that governs the entire public service, or 400,000 of us. Of those 11 spots, 5 are female, which is kind of as close as you can get to gender parity on an uneven number. I think 42.3% of the senior executive service is female, with a Premier's priority to increase that to 50% by 2025. So we're changing how we look structurally, which I think, you know, goes a long way, and we're also smashing glass ceilings. So there are a lot of firsts. The first female director of public prosecutions, the first female commissioner of the State Emergency Service, and within the Premier's own group of agencies, 3 out of the 4 CEOs are females. So it is a kind of good time to be alive right now, if you will, in the public service. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but there is such a momentum behind it. And to the points that were raised earlier, I think women calling it out and being outspoken and demanding more and saying it's not good enough has actually started to pay dividends, because somebody's listening, and we're actually, you know, we are getting those promotions, and we do have a seat at the leadership table, a lot more than we did 10 years ago.
I talked to Julia Banks in the Misrepresented series, and she was talking about, you know, obviously we've had a perfect lab experiment in Australia. We've got one party that 25, or more than 25 years ago now, set a gender quota and the other didn't. And you've sort of seen the response to that over time, which is that the ALP is nearly at parity and the Liberal Party is still lagging behind. She said that one of the problems for a political party, which is talking about the Liberal Party, is that while in business you can set targets and have wage incentives and performance bonuses and stuff like that, you can't do that in a political party. It's a harder beast to wrangle, I guess. That's true sort of for the public and private sector, isn't it? I mean, in the private sector you can use bonuses and so on, whereas in the public sector you can kind of set targets and kind of enforce them a bit more.
Yeah. So my observation is that, you know, the public service is actually at the vanguard here. They're at the forefront of cultural change, and it's led by fantastic women leaders in the public service like Amy, and the great news is there are so many others besides, and it's wonderful to see these women in their 30s and their 40s coming through the system, and nothing will stop them. It's fantastic.
Should we make more of their husbands redundant? Just a thought bubble. I don't know.
Works for me.
But you see, the thing is, it's quite a different. It's quite. If you look at Australia's economy, it's obviously the public sector is a big one. There's mining, construction. Well, you know, mining and construction, they're big ones. Transport, supply chains and logistics, they're big ones. They're all pretty blokey, and so the challenge is actually to feminise those kinds of industry sectors which aren't naturally feminised, right? And normally feminised, whereas Amy's skills are, she's brilliant, but there are men in the organisation with similar skills to hers, and there's nothing gendered about promotion. Whereas if you're a mining engineer, you're probably going to be a man in statistical terms. So you've got to feminise industries. And what's really interesting is that there's a reversal in the amount of women in senior management and CEOs. And one of the reasons for that, especially in the ASX 300, it's not as bad in the ASX 50. And those organisations, truthfully, are so big, they're more like the public service. You know, they've got huge HR departments, and they've got all the systems, really, that the public service has, although they're motivated by shareholder returns, you know, naturally. But it's the smaller companies and small businesses that find those gender targets really hard to meet. And in that CW census report, there are only 113 out of 300 ASX companies that are close to getting to their gender targets. And so it tells you that the challenge is further down the organisation and further down the size of companies and enterprises. And that's where we really have to encourage businesses to think more clearly and strongly and be more focused on this challenge.
I reassure you all, by the way, that in about 5 minutes I'll be giving you the opportunity to ask some questions. So do tap them in, and I'll be able to see them and put them to our panel. Wendy, we know that Australia was absolutely at the forefront of women being part of the electoral process, right? South Australia was the first place in the world through a strange, bungled piece of strategy where women could both vote and run for Parliament. And in 1902, we extended that nationally, although, of course, in an appalling and, over the years, unrecognised and unreported development, the vote was actually removed from Indigenous people at the same time in the same piece of legislation, which is a terrible blot on an otherwise terrific advance. But where are we now, do you think, in the world, Wendy? What's happened since?
26 in the OECD countries. We have fallen down in the leadership of women and in political polls. And we've fallen down in the safety of women in terms of domestic violence. Economic safety, we seem to be doing very well. And I guess as a person who's lived 8 decades and been involved in this one way or another since I've been about 16 in various ways. I mean, I was a mouse at university for the first year. But, I learnt to speak up and speak out, and I was, a country kid. And I think that when you tell those stories, the two of you, I'm so excited. But then I think we've almost been there before. Somehow or other, we seem to lose. We go 3 steps forward, and then we just seem to go away. Did we become complacent? I sit and I think to myself, how did we get to this place now, where we're not doing so well on many indicators as we were 25 years ago? What happened? What did we lose?
And the gender equity gap has increased from 12th place in the WEF group, in the World Economic Forum, from 12th to 70th just recently. That is a massive collapse.
And in the boards, it's interesting with that, with that latest bit for the CW and Baines and AICD. There are now in the first 200 companies, there is no board without a woman on it. But we've left behind the pipeline to get us to go through the next area. So my real concern at the moment is if women are to be incrementally promoted through systems and then start to look at becoming non-executive directors and having portfolio careers, and it's still tiny stuff in women's issues, really, don't get too excited about it. But it's important at lots of levels for the doors to be open. But if they don't get, if at the moment, there is not a pipeline that in a conventional way will put a woman on a board. However, if we look around now, we'll see men, they're being much more adventurous about appointing people to boards. They're taking punts, I mean, I've been put on a financial services board, My husband, the economist, practically fainted. And what would I know about it? And I said, I'll work it out. And the thing is, I wasn't there to do the numbers. I was there to change the culture. And I'm always apprehensive and a bit anxious about, whether I'll measure up to it or not. And then I think, yes, I will, because I've said yes, so I've taken the risk, and that's what we need to do. So I think we're learning to be less concerned about risk and much better at managing risk as women. And I think when we do that, I think that is what men value. So coming back to your first question to me, speaking out, most of the men I know who, apart, I've got the abusers, but they all changed over the years. And by the time the people who are abusing me were, in the 80s, and saying Ms. like that, they were asking, they were hiring me to be their mentors to their female staff by the 2000s.
So, with all of your experience in this strange and messy business of culture changing, which is not something you can really legislate for. It's not something, you can change the HR manual, but people still behave the way either they've always behaved or the way they see people around them behaving. What is the thing that people miss or don't get about changing culture? I want you to just...
Keeping your heart and head together.
Keep it, right, okay.
As soon as your heart and your head come together, nothing stops you. And you go slowly, you know when to pull back, you know when you're right, you know where your colleagues are, you know the people who'll help you, you know, in the dynamics of change, it's the people in the middle. You know, the ones who are crazy about it, you probably almost don't want on your side, and the ones who are completely negative, well, there's no point in trying to change them, they're the Trumpers. And then in the middle, you have to find colleagues with confidence, respect, discourse, and just humanity. You know, there's a common humanity about us all doing better. And it's a sweet spot in an organisation when you get there. It's the same when you're chairing a board. If you can just get to the point where we're saying, look, if we work like this, we don't like each other a lot maybe, but we just can do this, everything will be better. It's gorgeous.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, I mean, we've got a fairly good generational spread here across this panel, and one of the most, I've got to say, emotional things that happened to me when I was making this show was that Kate Sullivan, who, you know, she's the second longest serving woman in Australian political history. She started out in the Senate, as I said, no women's toilets, and then she was in the reps for a long time. And we did a long interview, and months later, when she had watched Brittany Higgins and seen her talk, Kate rang me back and said, there's something that I didn't tell you in the interview that I now want to tell you. And it was when she was involved in legislating the Sex Discrimination Act, and she was harassed by one of her own colleagues. And she had never told the story and was had just locked it away. But she thought, when I saw that younger woman telling her story, it made me feel emboldened. And it made me think, you never ever run out of opportunities to learn from other people, do you? How does the concept of learning from or being inspired by somebody younger than you work practically in the workplace? And should we be looking down, around and up more?
I think the Brittany Higgins event and Chanel Contos, that was actually, you know, a really important step in our cultural development and evolution, and I think improvement, where these young women in their late 20s and late 20s, I think they both are, actually came forward and said, yes, you know, this has happened to us and this is a terrible thing, but to have the bravery to come forward and call it out. And that's the other part of calling it out, like the silent idea appropriation is a much less traumatic form of that, but it's another thing of actually saying, yes, I was assaulted, yes, you know, this happens a lot at schools, etc. It actually wakes us all up and the scales fall from our eyes. I think a lot of us probably suspected it, but if you hadn't had direct experience, you didn't know.
And we never doubted them, did we? That's the most interesting thing. We haven't doubted those young women.
No, I think one of the most important things that they're showing is that they have learnt what to do. They've learnt that the shame doesn't attach to them.
Yes.
It attaches to the person who did this thing to them. And I think, because I was talking to my partner about this, and I was thinking, because I see it in my own daughter as well, who is not ashamed of anything, you know, and I think, well, how did, you know, she grow up like that? And then I thought, well, we didn't teach her to be ashamed of anything. And that is a really, it's a great intergenerational gift, I think, because those young women are kind of...
you know, my mother every day said to me, don't be bold.
Did she?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you didn't listen to her very much, did you?
My mother encouraged me to become a secretary and work for, you know, a lawyer or a doctor or something. I said, oh, I'm not going to do that. I'm a bit of a rebel.
Yeah. And do you think that these things, though, can they be powerful instruments of change? I mean, yes, they can, and it's huge. Don't we, though, need to declare, you know, gender equity and women's safety and anti-discrimination as the #1 issue for our country, and have men and women and national leaders all declare that?
Absolutely.
So that these can be powerful instruments of change, because otherwise there's not the foundation.
Just 50-50 and
but
everything.
Is the foundation currently there?
And don't settle for 30%, for goodness sake. Why would I want 30% of what a bloke has? Come on. 50-50.
As promised, I will open up for you all to ask some questions. I seriously could just monopolise this conversation for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. But we do have a question coming through. Do you think women could learn from their male counterparts and backslap each other more and support each other more, even if they're diametrically opposed? This is a really good question, because there is this issue of, like, do you support a woman with whom you fundamentally disagree, because in the long-term interests it helps to amplify all voices. Our questioner says, is the sisterhood strong enough to correct the balance of power? Who wants to go at that question?
Well, I'm happy to have a go at that. I think that I've worked in campaigns and in jobs and so on with both men and women whom I haven't particularly cared for, but we've found a way of working where we support common aims. And most of the women I've worked with who have completely politically, party political differences, I don't belong to a party, but anyway, they have differences and they have allegiances to the party. I just think I belong to the company of women. And I think people know that, so I don't find it difficult to work with people who have, and abortion is a classic case. There are lots of us, even when I was running family planning, it was so difficult for Catholic women, so difficult. I didn't want to punish them anymore about coming to family planning and so on. I wanted to encourage them and support them and, give them confidence. So there are plenty of things we agree about, so you just have to work out what it is, and by and large, I don't criticise other women publicly.
So for me, the fundamental thing, if you often deal with people whose values you don't 100% agree with, or less than 50%, you may not agree with them at all. But the issue, I think, and it applies to women, engaging with other women and working with other women and doing anything with other women, is actually to listen and to respect them.
Yeah.
And that applies to men too. That's not a gender-specific strategy. It's actually fundamental to human engagement and human relations and actually doing a good job. And it's especially important to listen to and respect the people that you don't agree with, because sometimes they might change your mind.
I think the other component of that, and the question was a bit around backslapping. I actually think, and that's great, I think what women can do even more so for each other, particularly in the context of a big meeting with lots of men in particular and some women, is create that psychological safety for each other. So, I have some pretty intimidating meetings that I have to attend, but it's like I subconsciously know that the few women in the room will give me that psychological safety of kind of agreeing or asking a follow-on question or giving me some space to have my voice heard.
Saying,
for
Amy,
discourse.
what do you think?
Exactly,
So
yeah.
often when I think that's what women can do, more senior women, if they're at a table and there are other younger women, you turn to them and you say, what do you think?
Yeah, and bring them in.
Yeah.
Or if they've been interrupted, say, no, Amy,
listening to Amy.
you keep going.
Yeah. I think that's the most value that we can give to each other in some of these.
Okay, that's great advice. The next question is another pretty good one. All of the panellists have referred to data. How important is measuring progress? And I wonder, I was going to put this to you, Amy, because I know you see a lot of data. And I wonder, can you think of an instance where knowing a set of data has helped you to make change?
To make change within, well, I mean, if we go, the Premier's priorities, right? It's, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. The Premier's priorities are the top kind of, 10 or so issues important to the Premier of the day. And gender equality in the senior public service is one of them, as is Aboriginal leadership and more people with a disability, joining the public service and feeling culturally comfortable enough to disclose that disability. So once there's data and monitoring and tracking and kind of almost KPIs around these things, we've seen the dial shift quite a lot. So for example, we were at 33% female leadership in 2014. We're now, as I said, at 42.7%, tracking toward 50%. Aboriginal...
So good.
I know. Aboriginal Australians in the senior public service, we wanted to get to 114 by 2025. Now that we're measuring it, we've surpassed that target already. We're already at 130. So once things start being measured, I think the data is there, and also just the data that helps people consider things from another point of view as well. So
not just the data, but the focus is there.
Yeah. Laser focus.
The laser focus, and that's important.
And it's because it means that people can't escape or shilly-shally around or say, well, that'll take care of itself. Because if you've got the information that shows you it's not being taken care of, then...
But the real result of that is the world didn't fall apart because people with disability, black fellas, unmarried women, came and joined the service.
Remember
right.
when you
That's
couldn't
the
really
real
diverse
advantage of data,
refugees?
isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, if we're making public policy for the whole of New South Wales, shouldn't the whole of New South Wales be represented?
Absolutely.
If we actually are to have powerful public policy. And sorry, one small anecdote. I was leading a project for the Premier during COVID, and it was all about the social outcomes of a COVID recession, or even more acute now as a result of the latest outbreak. And it occurred to me that the people we were making public policy for, their experience of COVID was completely different from ours. It wasn't about COVID kilos and bottled cocktails and too many Teams meetings. They were looking at, disadvantage layer on disadvantage, kids with the digital divide, Indigenous Australians in Wilcannia. And it's that kind of diversity bias, because even though we had some women around the table, we didn't really have a diverse table when we were making those policy recommendations.
And that's the thing about this pandemic, is it's actually really sharpened the divide between the people like us who can live their lives on Teams or Zoom or whatever it is, on the one hand, and the healthcare workers and construction workers and other people who simply cannot, simply cannot do that. And I think if this pandemic's taught us anything, it's actually the importance of valuing the work that they do, not just in a tokenistic way, but really bringing them in to the conversation and the way the place is run.
Yep. And not assuming that everybody's life is the same as yours,
everybody
which
can
is
do it on Teams.
That's
diversity
great
bias.
leadership. Gosh, we're nearly out of time, but we do have time for one more question, just because it's a really provocative one, and I think it will address something that you've all come across at various points of your very diverse careers. Amy said, says our questioner, that the public sector changes things, but the private sector normalises them. But, says the questioner, the private sector don't like taking advice from government on what they consider organisational business issues. How do you address that?
Oh, so I've got a classic. So I'm sitting in a big restaurant in Sydney, big international speaker. She's talking about being one of the most successful women in the world. Pepsi, managing director, and someone says, it's a pretty private sector group, and someone says, how did you get the change in the company? And she said, well, we drew up these guidelines and we just stuck to them. And they said, we don't have anything like that in this country. And I said, we've had guidelines, anti-discrimination legislation. We have state-of-the-art guidelines in the public sector. And she's quite a good friend. She turned to me, she said, why would we take any notice of what happens in the public sector? Seriously, I could barely speak to her for the next 2 months.
Listen, there is a bit of that, a bit of a divide, but the great news is that people like Amy moved from the private to the public sector, and my life's very much going between the private and the public sector. And I think you cross-fertilise each other. The public sector does some things really well, and the private sector does too. But there are organisations.
We are the exception going backwards and
forwards.
But
I think it should be encouraged. I think it should be encouraged. But I think like the ASX and the AICD and CEW. They're all, from the private sector perspective, really championing and advocating a much stronger focus on participation of women. To the extent, some of these regulations and rules are a bit sort of, a bit tight and sort of ridiculous. So I was helping write an annual report for a public company, I was chairing, and it talked all about diversity. And I said, well, no, we don't just have a lot of senior women, we actually have quite a lot of people from different backgrounds. Can we talk about that? And they said, no, you don't talk about that. We're just talking about gender diversity. I thought, well, that's kind of nuts.
It's mad.
That the template is all about just gender diversity.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
That's,
if we want,
the narrowness
51% of our population represented, we want the whole of that 51%, not just.
But we, on our side, we're the 51%. We don't need to take all the other diversity on our side. We'll share it across the room.
Oh my gosh,
exactly.
We could really be here for hours, couldn't we? Look, I just wanted to say, because time is really running out for us, I'm so pleased to be in a room with all three of you. I think it's, I'm so pleased that you didn't follow your mother's instructions to be meek. And Lucy, I'm very pleased that you didn't go on to be a doctor's secretary. And Amy, I'm very pleased that you are moving in and out and cross-pollinating these ideas between the private and public sector, because that is, in the end, how we work it out, right?
That's right.
Ideas shift and they become obvious, and then 20 years later, people wonder why we ever had the argument. And the late, great Susan Ryan, to whom I spoke a lot while we were planning our documentary, but we sadly missed out by 4 days on getting her on camera. But she said that when the Sex Discrimination Act was going through Parliament, it was the most extraordinary hullabaloo, protesters, and then she said nowadays people just can't imagine why there was ever a drama. And that is, I guess, what kind of winning looks like, right?
And her mantra was just keep going.
Just keep going.
Just keep going.
That's a pretty good panel mantra too. So thank you very much for being here today. It's just been an unalloyed treat to speak with you and hear your insights. And as promised, going back to you now.
Thanks, Annabel. I'd like to sincerely thank our outstanding panel for your insights today. It's been a real privilege to talk to you. It's clear that while Australia may have led the way from a structural and legislative perspective around the female vote and women in Parliament, the cultural piece still needs our attention. And this applies as much, or if not more, to the private sector as it does in government. Misrepresented and the discussion we've had here today are very important parts of that narrative. Thanks once again to all our panellists and to our attendees who've been watching. A reminder to everyone who's registered, you'll shortly receive a link that'll give you access to a recording of this forum. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you next time.